The Book of Ruth, a story of loss, loyalty, redemption, and God's hidden plan. The story of Ruth begins during the time of the Judges. It was a difficult season in Israel's history. The nation was spiritually confused. People were turning away from God. Everyone was doing what seemed right in their own eyes. But in the middle of that darkness, God begins a beautiful story. Not through a king, not through an army, not through a battlefield, but through an ordinary family. The story begins in Bethlehem. A man named Elimelech lived there with his wife Naomi and their two sons, Mahlon and Kilian. Bethlehem means house of bread. But ironically, the land was suffering from famine. There was no food. The fields were empty. The future looked uncertain. So Elimelech makes a decision. He leaves Bethlehem and travels to the land of Moab with his family, looking for survival. But sometimes the place we run to for relief can bring unexpected challenges. In Moab, tragedy strikes. Elimelech dies. Naomi becomes a widow. Her two sons marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. But after about 10 years, another tragedy comes. Both sons die. Now Naomi is left without her husband, without her sons, and without security. She is a woman carrying deep sorrow. Imagine Naomi's situation. She left Bethlehem with a family. She returns empty. She left with hope. She returns with grief. When she comes back, the people ask, "Is this Naomi?" But Naomi responds, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Naomi means pleasant. Mara means bitter. Her pain had become so heavy that she felt defined by her suffering. But what Naomi could not see was that God was already beginning a new chapter. A painful season does not mean God has abandoned the story. Sometimes God is working in places we cannot yet see. Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. She tells her daughters-in-law to go back to their own families. Orpah eventually says goodbye, but Ruth refuses. She makes one of the most powerful commitments in Scripture. "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Ruth 1:16. This was not just loyalty to Naomi. It was a declaration of faith. Ruth was leaving her homeland, leaving her culture, leaving her past. She was choosing the God of Israel. A Moabite woman becomes part of God's covenant story. Faith often begins with a decision to follow God, even when the future is uncertain. Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem, but they are poor. They have no land, no husband, no income. In those days, widows had very limited options. They needed provision, so Ruth does something humble. She goes into the fields to gather leftover grain after the harvesters. This practice was called gleaning. God had commanded Israel to leave portions of their harvest for the poor and the foreigners. Even in the law, God had already made provision for people like Ruth. The field Ruth enters belongs to a man named Boaz. Boaz is a wealthy man, but more importantly, he is a man of kindness and faith. When he sees Ruth, he asks, "Who is this young woman?" He learns her story. He hears about her loyalty to Naomi. He tells Ruth, "I have heard about all you have done for your mother-in-law." Boaz allows Ruth to gather grain freely. He protects her. He provides for her. He tells his workers not to trouble her. A woman who arrived as a stranger begins experiencing favor. God can open doors in places where we least expect it. A field that looked like a place of survival became the place where God began her restoration. Ruth continues working faithfully. She does not sit waiting for a miracle. She takes responsibility. She works with humility. Boaz notices her character. He does not just see her circumstances. He sees her heart. This is a powerful picture. Ruth had lost almost everything, but she had not lost her integrity. Character often opens doors that talent cannot. Naomi sees that Boaz is a close relative. According to Israel's customs, a close relative could act as a redeemer. A redeemer could restore what had been lost. Naomi instructs Ruth to approach Boaz respectfully and ask him to fulfill this role. Ruth does so. Boaz is moved by Ruth's character and willingness. He says she has shown even greater kindness. But there is one problem. There is another relative closer than Boaz. The matter must be settled properly. Boaz goes to the city gate, where important decisions were made. He meets the closer relative. He explains that Naomi's land can be redeemed, but the responsibility includes Ruth as well. The closer relative refuses. He does not want the responsibility. So Boaz steps forward. He agrees to redeem Naomi's family line. He agrees to marry Ruth. What began as a story of loss becomes a story of restoration. Boaz marries Ruth. The woman who arrived in Bethlehem as a poor foreign widow becomes the wife of a respected man. God turns her mourning into joy. The people bless Ruth and Boaz. They pray that their family will become great. And God answers. Ruth gives birth to a son named Obed. The women of Bethlehem celebrate with Naomi. They tell her, "Praise be to the Lord who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer." The woman who once said, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty," now holds a child in her arms. Her emptiness has become fullness. Her bitterness has become joy. The story ends with a genealogy. Obed becomes the father of Jesse. Jesse becomes the father of King David, and through the family line of David comes Jesus Christ. A Moabite woman who seemed forgotten becomes part of the story of salvation. A foreigner becomes part of God's chosen family. A widow becomes part of the royal line. A story that began with famine ends with a future king. The great lessons of Ruth. 1. God is working even when life feels empty. Naomi could only see her pain. God could see her purpose. 2. Faith requires commitment. Ruth did not know what the future held, but she trusted the God she was choosing. 3. Small acts of faithfulness matter. Ruth simply worked, served, and remained faithful. Those ordinary actions became part of a great divine plan. 4. God is a redeemer. Boaz redeemed what was lost. This points to Jesus, who redeems humanity and restores what sin has damaged. 5. Your current chapter is not the final chapter. Ruth's story began with loss, grief, uncertainty, but it ended with blessing, purpose, legacy. The Book of Ruth is a reminder that God often writes his greatest stories through ordinary people in ordinary places. Ruth was not a warrior. She was not a prophet. She was not a queen. She was simply a woman who chose faithfulness, and through her faithfulness, God changed her destiny. The message of Ruth is this: when you remain faithful to God in the difficult seasons, you may discover that God has been preparing a blessing you could not yet see. The God who turned Ruth's emptiness into a legacy is still the God who restores, redeems, and writes new chapters.